Malcolm Reed's flight from New York to Los Angeles appeared to be just another routine day. The plane was full, and as it taxied down the runway, Malcolm, an undercover FBI agent, had his headphones on listening to music. Today he had swapped his usual suit and tie for jeans and a plain t-shirt, effortlessly blending in with the other passengers. As the plane ascended, Malcolm scanned the cabin, noticing a diverse mix of families, business people, and tourists. Among them, a woman in first class stood out. Dressed in expensive clothes adorned with gold jewelry and wearing a haughty expression, she had been complaining loudly since boarding. Malcolm had encountered her type too many times before, what people nowadays referred to as a Karen. With a resigned sigh, he thought every flight seemed to have one, and today she appeared determined to make everyone else's day miserable. The flight attendants were already whispering about her as she grumbled about her seat's discomfort and demanded special treatment. Malcolm decided to keep his distance. His plan was simple: stay quiet, read a book, and hope the flight passed without incident. But it didn't take long for things to spiral downhill. An hour into the flight, as the attendants began to distribute snacks and drinks, Malcolm heard the woman's voice rising from across the cabin. She was arguing with a flight attendant, her voice loud enough to draw attention. "This is outrageous. I specifically asked for sparkling water, not this, whatever this is." She held up a can of soda like it was toxic. "Well, what kind of service is this? I'm a paying customer and I demand respect." The flight attendant, trying her best to remain calm, apologized and explained that they had run out of sparkling water. The woman scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes and muttering something under her breath that made the flight attendant flinch. Malcolm, already annoyed, put his headphones back on, hoping to drown out the noise. He had dealt with entitled and obnoxious people like her before, always seeking to ruin someone's day. He knew better than to get involved. However, the woman's attention soon shifted, and that's when things took a turn for the worse. As the flight attendant moved away, the woman's eyes landed on Malcolm, who was now standing up to stretch. She narrowed her eyes, her lips curling into a sneer as she looked him up and down. Malcolm noticed her gaze but pretended not to care. He didn't want to make a scene, but she wasn't about to let it go. "Excuse me," she snapped, waving her hand in his direction. "You in the back, you need to sit down. You're blocking the aisle." Malcolm turned, realizing she was talking to him. He wasn't even in the aisle, just stretching near his seat. Calmly he responded, "I'm not in the aisle, ma'am. I'll be sitting in a moment." Her eyes flared with anger. "Don't ma'am me. I've been watching you since we boarded this plane, acting like you own the place. This isn't your neighborhood. You people always think you can do whatever you want." The phrase "you people" hung in the air and Malcolm felt his jaw clench. He had dealt with racists before, but in the tight confines of an airplane with everyone watching, the situation felt different. The other passengers were silent, their eyes darting between the two of them, unsure of what to do. "Excuse me?" Malcolm said, his voice steady despite the tension. "You heard me," she barked, her voice growing louder and drawing more attention. "I don't know how someone like you even got on this plane, but you need to learn some respect. I paid good money for this seat, and I won't have people like you ruining my flight." People around them shifted uncomfortably, some whispering among themselves, others just watching in stunned silence. The flight attendants hadn't intervened yet, perhaps hoping the situation would de-escalate. Malcolm knew he needed to stay calm. He was representing more than just himself here. "I'm just trying to fly like everyone else, ma'am," Malcolm said, his tone patient but firm. "Please don't make this into something it doesn't need to be." But she wasn't having it. "People like you always think you can play the victim," she sneered, her voice dripping with condescension. "You've been glaring at me since we boarded, haven't you? I can tell you think you're entitled to everything. I should call security the moment we land." Malcolm felt a wave of anger rising but forced himself to take a breath. He wasn't about to let this woman provoke him, not here, not now. But before he could respond, she took it a step further. "You probably don't even belong in this country," she spat. "I bet you're one of those freeloaders taking from hard-working people like me. If it were up to me, you wouldn't even be allowed on this plane." The air in the cabin grew thick with tension. Malcolm could feel the eyes of every passenger on him. His fists clenched at his sides, but he knew he couldn't react the way he wanted to. His training had prepared him for handling tense, volatile situations with composure, but this was different. This was personal. And then, as if things couldn't get worse, she raised her voice even more. "Somebody needs to put you in your place." Malcolm took another deep breath, fighting to maintain his composure, knowing that the next few moments would be crucial in determining how this situation would unfold. Malcolm could feel the weight of every passenger's eyes on him, but he kept his gaze steady. The woman, her face twisted with anger and entitlement, was now standing, pointing directly at him. The flight attendants were scrambling, trying to maintain control of the situation, but no one seemed willing to step in. It was as if the whole plane had frozen in time, waiting for anyone to act. "I said sit down," the woman barked again, loud enough for people across the plane to hear. "You're making everyone uncomfortable." Malcolm stayed composed, but inside he could feel the fire rising. He had been through worse, much worse, but it never got any easier. The blatant racism, the public humiliation, and the fact that no one was stepping in to stop it, it was a familiar scene, but it didn't make it hurt any less. A young woman seated near the front, who had been quietly observing the entire situation, leaned toward the flight attendant closest to her. "Are you going to do something about this?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly with frustration. "This is getting out of hand." The flight attendant, looking equally frazzled, nodded and began moving toward the woman causing the scene. But before she could say a word, the woman raised her hand to silence her. "I don't need you telling me how to behave," she snapped at the flight attendant. "Do your job and get this man off this plane." The flight attendant froze, looking uncertain as if she didn't know whether to intervene or step back. It was clear that she was afraid of escalating things further. Malcolm couldn't blame her. He knew how these situations could spiral out of control quickly. Still, he couldn't just stand there in silence anymore. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I haven't done anything to you. I suggest you sit down and enjoy your flight." That only seemed to fuel her rage. "Don't you tell me what to do," she screamed, her voice breaking with anger. "You people are all the same, always acting like you're the victims, always thinking you're owed something. I know your type, always trying to stir up trouble." The entire cabin had gone quiet now. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Malcolm felt the urge to defend himself more forcefully, but he knew that engaging with her would only make things worse. He had to stay calm despite the insults being hurled his way. Suddenly, a man in the row behind Malcolm stood up. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and clearly uncomfortable with how things were unfolding. "Lady, you need to calm down," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension. "You're out of line." The woman turned her venomous gaze toward him. "Don't you dare tell me to calm down," she snapped. "I'm the one being harassed here. I paid for my seat, I deserve respect." The man shook his head in disbelief. "You're not the one being harassed. Look around, no one's on your side. You're making a fool of yourself." Several other passengers nodded in agreement, and some murmured in support of the man's words. The tide was slowly turning, but the woman wasn't backing down. "I'll have you all removed from this plane," she shrieked, her face flushed with fury. "You're all just jealous because I'm not afraid to speak the truth." Malcolm took a deep breath, his mind racing. He wasn't about to let this escalate further, but it was clear that the woman wasn't going to stop on her own. He looked over at the flight attendants, who were still hesitating, unsure of how to defuse the situation. And then, just as things seemed like they were reaching a boiling point, another voice rang out from the front of the plane. "Ma'am, you need to sit down now." It was the pilot who had come out of the cockpit to assess the situation. His voice was calm but authoritative, and it immediately commanded the attention of everyone in the cabin. The woman, her face contorted with rage, turned toward him, her mouth opening to argue. But before she could say anything, the pilot raised his hand. "This behavior will not be tolerated on this flight," he said, his voice unwavering. "Either you sit down and stop causing a disturbance, or we'll have to turn this plane around." For the first time, the woman seemed to hesitate. She glanced around the cabin, seeing the disapproving stares from the other passengers. The reality of the situation was starting to set in. She was no longer in control and everyone around her was against her. Still, she wasn't ready to let go of her anger completely. She crossed her arms, glaring at Malcolm with a look of pure disdain. "This isn't over," she muttered under her breath, her voice venomous. Malcolm didn't respond. He had seen enough of this behavior to know that engaging further wouldn't help. He sat down quietly, trying to ignore the stares from the other passengers, but inside he couldn't shake the anger and frustration bubbling up. The pilot, satisfied that the situation had calmed, nodded to the flight attendants and returned to the cockpit. The rest of the passengers slowly turned back to their own business, though the air was still thick with tension. As the flight continued, Malcolm couldn't help but think about how quickly things had escalated. One minute he was just another passenger trying to get to his destination, and the next he was the target of a racist outburst in front of dozens of people. It was a feeling he had experienced too many times before, but that didn't make it any easier. The woman, though she had quieted down, was still seething in her seat. Every now and then Malcolm could feel her eyes on him, but he refused to give her the satisfaction of reacting. He had a job to do and he wasn't going to let her get in the way of that. But what she didn't know, what none of the passengers knew, was who he really was. And soon enough, that fact was going to come to light in a way that no one, least of all the woman, could have anticipated. The plane had settled into an uncomfortable silence. Although the immediate conflict had been diffused, the tension still lingered, and the passengers were clearly on edge. Malcolm could feel the woman, who everyone had already labeled a Karen, fuming in her seat. She muttered under her breath now and then, casting bitter glances his way. Her face was still tight with anger, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrests. But for now she was quiet. Malcolm shifted in his seat, trying to focus on the window beside him. Clouds rolled past in lazy puffs, and the hum of the engines filled his ears. He knew that the rest of the flight would be long, not just because of the time in the air, but because of the thick tension that surrounded him. But he had been through worse, much worse. The woman's words echoed in his mind, "You people." It was a phrase that always stung no matter how many times he heard it. Even with his calm demeanor, Malcolm couldn't help but feel the anger bubbling beneath the surface. He had dealt with enough racism in his life, and every time it happened, it left a scar. He closed his eyes, trying to center himself. "Breathe," he told himself. "Stay calm." The flight attendants had begun their service, offering drinks and snacks to the passengers. But Malcolm could see the nervous glances they cast in his direction, a reminder that the tension was still very much present. The unease among the passengers was palpable, as if everyone was collectively holding their breath. Malcolm wasn't sure if the passengers were afraid of another outburst or simply uneasy about the entire situation, but it was clear they were eager to avoid confrontation. However, Karen was not finished. After a few minutes of glaring in Malcolm's direction, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up again. A collective shift of discomfort rippled through the nearby passengers. A man sitting across the aisle from Malcolm shot her a warning look, but she ignored it. Her lips curled into a sneer as she turned to face Malcolm once more. "Look at you," she spat, her voice dripping with contempt. "Sitting there like you've done nothing wrong. I bet you think you're so innocent, don't you?" Malcolm didn't answer. He kept his gaze forward, but inside, the frustration was beginning to build. Karen took another step forward, now standing directly in the aisle beside his row. "You don't belong here," she said, her voice louder this time. "I know what people like you do. You cause trouble. You make everyone around you feel unsafe." A few passengers gasped at her words, but no one intervened. Malcolm remained seated, refusing to rise to the bait, but he could feel the weight of every eye on him again. "I'm not the problem," he said finally, his voice calm but firm. "You are." Karen's face twisted into an ugly sneer. "Me? I'm the problem? You've got some nerve. You've insulted me, threatened me, and tried to turn this whole plane against me." "I haven't said a word to you," Malcolm continued, his voice measured. "You don't know me. You don't know who I am or what I've done." Her eyes narrowed and she let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, I know exactly who you are. You're just another thug, thinking you can get away with anything because everyone's too scared to say something." Malcolm felt the heat rise in his chest, but he kept his face neutral. "Ma'am, you need to sit down." "I'll sit down when I'm good and ready," she snapped, her voice rising again. "People like you are the reason this country is going down the drain." The murmurs in the cabin grew louder now, passengers whispering among themselves. Some were clearly shocked at her brazen racism, while others looked around as if hoping someone would step in to stop the madness. But still no one moved. The flight attendant, who had been lingering at the front of the plane, finally stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to return to your seat," she said, her voice tentative but insistent. Karen whipped around to face her, her eyes flashing with anger. "Don't you dare tell me what to do," she hissed. "This man is a danger, and I'm not going to sit here quietly while he's allowed to stay on this plane." The flight attendant looked helpless, caught between the angry passenger and the rules she was supposed to enforce. Malcolm could see the fear in her eyes, but she didn't back down. "Ma'am," she said again, a little more firmly this time, "you need to sit down. If you continue to cause a disturbance, we will have no choice but to land the plane and have you removed." Karen's face flushed red, but for a moment, it seemed like the threat of being thrown off the flight was enough to quiet her. She turned back toward Malcolm, her eyes burning with hatred, but she didn't say another word. Instead, she huffed loudly and stormed back to her seat, plopping down in a furious rage. Malcolm let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His heart was racing, but he kept his composure. He glanced around, noticing the tension among the passengers. Some gave him sympathetic looks, but most averted their eyes, not wanting to get involved. For the next few minutes, the cabin was eerily quiet. Karen was still muttering under her breath, her eyes fixed on Malcolm with a mixture of anger and disgust, but she didn't make another move. The flight attendants continued their service, trying to act as though everything was normal, but Malcolm could see the unease in their faces. He leaned back in his seat, hoping the rest of the flight would pass without further incident. But deep down he knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to let things go. He had dealt with people like her before, and they always found a way to escalate things. Sure enough, after a few moments of silence, she spoke again, her voice low but audible enough for those around her to hear. "This isn't over," she muttered. "Not by a long shot." Malcolm didn't respond. He had learned long ago not to engage with people like her, but something told him that this confrontation was far from finished. The storm was only brewing, and it was only a matter of time before it reached its breaking point. The quiet after Karen's last remark didn't last long. Although she had returned to her seat, everyone in the surrounding rows could feel her bitter energy. Malcolm tried his best to block it out. His years of training in the FBI had taught him patience, the ability to stay calm under pressure. But this wasn't just about keeping cool in a dangerous situation, it was personal. Karen's insults had cut deep, reminding him of the prejudices he'd faced throughout his life. A little boy in the row ahead turned around, peering curiously at Malcolm. His innocent gaze was a refreshing change from the suspicious or nervous glances of the other passengers. "Are you okay, mister?" the boy asked, his small voice piercing through the tension. Malcolm managed a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm fine, thanks for asking." The boy's mother, who had been watching the whole ordeal unfold, pulled him back into his seat and whispered something in his ear. The boy nodded but kept sneaking looks at Malcolm, clearly fascinated by the entire situation. Malcolm's thoughts wandered back to the day he had first joined the bureau. He had been eager, full of hope that he could make a real difference. He had faced his fair share of doubters, people who looked at him and only saw his skin color, not his skills or dedication. But he had proven them wrong time and time again. Karen had no idea who she was messing with. The thought gave him some comfort, but it didn't erase the anger still simmering inside. He shifted in his seat again, willing the hours to pass faster. Every moment in this confined space seemed to stretch into an eternity, with Karen just a few seats away, still fuming. Suddenly Karen stood up again. Malcolm clenched his jaw, bracing for another confrontation. He could see other passengers roll their eyes, clearly frustrated with her never-ending antics. But this time she didn't address him directly. Instead, she stomped toward the front of the plane, waving down one of the flight attendants. "This is unacceptable," she shouted loud enough for half the plane to hear. "You're letting that man stay on this flight when he's making everyone uncomfortable? Are you people insane? He's probably a criminal." The flight attendant, a middle-aged woman with a tired expression, sighed. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. We've asked you multiple times to calm down." Karen's face flushed a deep shade of red, one Malcolm had only seen once before when a suspect broke down under interrogation. "Calm down? You want me to calm down when that man is sitting back there thinking he can get away with whatever he wants?" she screeched, her voice rising in pitch. Malcolm watched silently, knowing that whatever Karen said next would be even more outrageous. Sure enough, she didn't disappoint. "I demand to see some ID from him," she declared, her voice a high-pitched screech now. "He probably doesn't even belong here. You people need to do your jobs and check if he's actually supposed to be on this flight." The flight attendant looked stunned, clearly at a loss for words. "Ma'am, we cannot ask passengers for their identification once they've boarded the flight. Everyone here has already passed security." "That's not good enough," Karen shot back. "What if he's dangerous? He could be a terrorist for all you know." Malcolm's heart rate quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. He had dealt with enough situations like this to know that losing his cool wouldn't solve anything. He glanced at the people around him, noting their reactions. Some looked horrified at Karen's behavior, while others seemed resigned as if they were used to people like her causing a scene. Before the flight attendant could respond, another passenger, a tall man sitting a few rows ahead, stood up. His voice was calm but firm. "Ma'am, you need to sit down. You're the only one causing a problem here." Karen whirled around, glaring at him. "And who do you think you are? You don't know anything about what's going on. You should be thanking me for trying to keep us all safe." The man raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "You're not keeping anyone safe. You're just making things worse." A few passengers murmured in agreement, and Karen's face twisted with anger. "Oh, now you're all against me?" she snapped. "I'm the only one with enough guts to say what everyone else is thinking, and this is the thanks I get?" Malcolm watched the scene unfold, still choosing to remain silent. He knew that if he intervened now, it would only escalate things further. Let her dig her own grave, he thought. The flight attendant had apparently reached the end of her patience. She stepped forward, her voice sterner than before. "Ma'am, this is your last warning. Return to your seat, or we will have to make an emergency landing to remove you from the flight." Karen's eyes bulged as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You're going to throw me off the plane?" "Meh. Not that man back there. That man hasn't done anything wrong," the flight attendant said firmly. "You, on the other hand, are disturbing the peace." For a moment it looked like Karen might actually comply. She glanced around the cabin, realizing that she had lost the support of everyone around her. The passengers were staring at her with disgust, some shaking their heads. But Karen wasn't the type to back down so easily. "You're all blind," she hissed, turning back toward Malcolm. "You don't know what people like him are capable of." The flight attendant raised her hand, signaling to her colleague at the front of the plane. "Ma'am, if you don't sit down right now, we're going to have to call for backup." Malcolm could feel the tension in the air shift. Karen was on the verge of losing whatever control she had left, her face twisted with rage. For a moment, Malcolm thought she might actually lash out at the flight attendant. But before she could do anything, the tall man from earlier stepped into the aisle, putting himself between Karen and the rest of the passengers. "Enough," he said, his voice commanding. "Sit down." Karen blinked, taken aback by the force in his tone. She opened her mouth to argue, but something in the man's expression made her hesitate. Slowly, grudgingly, she turned and stomped back to her seat, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. The entire cabin seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The flight attendant nodded at the tall man in gratitude before returning to her duties. Malcolm remained silent, but inside he knew this wasn't the last he would hear from Karen. The atmosphere in the cabin slowly started to settle after Karen stomped back to her seat. Passengers exchanged glances, whispering quietly among themselves, while others remained silent, shaking their heads at the scene that had just unfolded. Malcolm sat quietly, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes staring straight ahead. Though Karen had been momentarily subdued, he knew better than to assume the situation was over. People like her never gave up that easily. He shifted slightly in his seat, feeling the weight of the stares that occasionally flicked his way. Some were sympathetic, while others held an awkward uncertainty, as if they weren't quite sure how to process what had happened. One man in the row across from him gave Malcolm a nod, a small gesture of solidarity, but Malcolm didn't respond. He wasn't looking for support or validation. He just wanted the flight to end without any more drama. A few minutes passed and the flight attendants resumed their duties, walking down the aisle offering drinks and snacks. The hum of conversation gradually picked up, but it was clear that the tension still lingered. Every now and then, Malcolm could hear snippets of people's conversations as they debated Karen's outburst in hushed tones. "Can you believe that woman? How embarrassing for her. I've never seen anything like that before." Just as things seemed to be calming down, Malcolm caught sight of Karen again. She had been glaring at him from her seat, and now she was leaning forward, muttering under her breath. It wasn't loud enough for the flight attendants to hear, but Malcolm could pick up the occasional word. "Shouldn't even be here. Criminals like him, disgusting." He clenched his fists, his patience wearing thin. He had spent years developing a thick skin, learning how to ignore ignorant comments and keeping his composure in stressful situations. But there was something about Karen's relentless attitude that was testing his limits. Her complete disregard for human decency, her assumption that she was superior to him just because of the color of his skin, it was infuriating. The man sitting next to Karen, who had been quiet up until now, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He glanced toward Malcolm, then back at Karen, clearly torn between wanting to say something and not wanting to get involved. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he turned to her. "Ma'am, I think you've said enough," he murmured, his voice low but firm. Karen's eyes snapped to the man who had spoken, her face contorting with irritation. "Excuse me, who do you think you are?" she hissed. The man swallowed nervously but didn't back down. "You're making everyone uncomfortable. Just let it go, all right? Let it go." Karen repeated, her voice rising again. "Are you serious? I'm the only one here who seems to understand the kind of threat we're dealing with. You should be thanking me for trying to protect us." The man sighed, rubbing his temples in frustration. "He's not a threat. You're the one causing all the problems. For a moment, Karen looked as if she might explode. Her hands clenched the armrests, her knuckles white. Malcolm could see the fury bubbling just beneath the surface. But instead of yelling, she let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Oh, you're all blind," she muttered loud enough for several people nearby to hear. "You don't get it. You don't know what people like him are capable of." Malcolm shifted in his seat again, his patience nearing its breaking point. He had dealt with difficult people in his line of work, but Karen was pushing the boundaries. He considered getting up, maybe finding one of the flight attendants and asking for some space, but he knew that would only draw more attention to himself and give Karen another excuse to make a scene. Just when he thought the tension couldn't escalate any further, Karen stood up again. This time, her eyes were locked on Malcolm, her lips curling into a sneer. "I don't know why everyone's so scared of saying the truth," she said loudly, making sure her words carried throughout the cabin. "I've seen his type before. They always think they can get away with anything because people are too scared to call them out. But not me. I'm not scared." A few gasps rippled through the nearby passengers, and Malcolm could see several people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. He clenched his jaw, trying to hold back the surge of anger rising inside him. He had dealt with worse, far worse during his career. But this was different. This wasn't about a suspect, a criminal, or someone breaking the law. This was about a woman who thought she could humiliate and dehumanize him in front of everyone simply because she assumed he didn't belong. The tall man who had stood up earlier turned around in his seat again, his face set in a firm frown. "Ma'am, you need to stop," he said, his voice steady but stern. Karen ignored him, her eyes still fixed on Malcolm. "What's the matter?" she taunted. "Can't defend yourself? Of course you can't. People like you. That's enough." The sharp voice of a flight attendant cut through the air, silencing Karen mid-sentence. The same flight attendant who had warned her earlier was now standing just a few feet away, her expression one of complete authority. "Ma'am, this is your final warning. If you don't sit down and stop harassing this passenger, we will have no choice but to take action." Karen's face twisted with indignation, but she didn't argue this time. She looked around, realizing that no one was on her side anymore. The passengers were done with her outbursts, and even the man sitting next to her had turned away, clearly wanting nothing more to do with her. With a huff, Karen dropped back into her seat, crossing her arms and muttering under her breath. The flight attendant gave her a final warning glance before turning and walking back toward the front of the plane. Malcolm let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The tension in the air was still thick, but at least for now, Karen had been silenced. He knew it was only a temporary reprieve though. People like her didn't stay quiet for long. The cabin had returned to a fragile state of calm, but Malcolm could feel the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Karen's glare bore into the back of his head, and though she was momentarily silenced by the flight attendant's warning, he knew it wouldn't last. There was a palpable sense that something was still bubbling, waiting for an excuse to erupt again. Malcolm tried to focus on the in-flight magazine in front of him, flipping through the pages absently, but the words blurred together. He was still trying to make sense of everything. He wasn't a stranger to confrontation. As an FBI agent, he had faced far more dangerous situations. But this, being publicly humiliated simply for the color of his skin, had hit differently. It wasn't something his badge or training could shield him from. Suddenly his phone buzzed in his pocket. Relieved for the distraction, he pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was a message from his supervisor, a quick update on the operation he had been involved in before taking this flight. Malcolm's heart raced for a moment as he read the details. The timing of the mission was critical and they were counting on him. He tapped out a quick response, confirming that he would land as planned and proceed directly to the meetup. Despite the tension still lingering in the air, his focus momentarily shifted back to the job. It was the kind of high-stakes operation that had been in the works for months, and his role was crucial. But that didn't mean the current situation was any less significant. He put his phone away and sat back, steeling himself for whatever might come next. As the plane continued its journey, the hum of conversation slowly resumed around him, though there was still an undercurrent of unease. Every now and then he caught someone glancing his way, their expressions a mixture of pity and curiosity. It was the kind of look he had seen too many times before. People didn't know how to react when they witnessed racism firsthand. They were uncomfortable, unsure of what to do, and more often than not, they chose to do nothing. Just as Malcolm started to relax again, he heard Karen's voice. It was quieter this time but no less venomous. She was leaning over the aisle, talking to the man seated next to her in a low, conspiratorial tone. Malcolm couldn't make out every word, but he caught enough to know she hadn't let go of her animosity. "I don't care what they say, shouldn't be allowed on planes, people like that." The man next to her looked incredibly uncomfortable, nodding slightly but avoiding eye contact. He clearly didn't want to engage with her, but Karen's relentless need to justify her actions made it impossible for him to escape the conversation. She continued her tirade, making wild claims and generalizations that made Malcolm's stomach churn. He tried to ignore it, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. Malcolm, hoping to shift everyone's focus to the descent, welcomed the change, praying it would keep Karen from further disruptions. However, Karen had other plans. As the plane slightly tilted, preparing for landing, Karen unbuckled her seatbelt, ignoring the illuminated sign. Her sudden movement sparked concern throughout the cabin, prompting a flight attendant to rush over. "Ma'am, you need to sit down," the attendant said firmly, her tone leaving no room for debate. "We're preparing to land." But Karen was undeterred. "I'm getting my bag," she replied sharply, as if the rules didn't apply to her. The attendant, now more forceful, repeated, "Ma'am, sit down now." Karen's eyes flared with indignation. "Do you know who I am?" she snapped, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby passengers. "I don't need to listen to you." The flight attendant, accustomed to dealing with unruly passengers, didn't back down. "If you don't sit down right now, we will have to report you to the authorities upon landing." For a brief moment, Karen hesitated, her eyes darting nervously towards the front of the plane. But then she doubled down, crossing her arms defiantly. "Go ahead. I'm not the one you should be worried about," she said, casting a hateful glance at Malcolm. "Why don't you ask him what he's hiding?" Tension skyrocketed, and Malcolm felt the weight of the entire plane's gaze shift towards him. It was as if time had slowed down, the air thick with anticipation. Passengers, who had been minding their own business, were now openly staring, waiting to see what would happen next. The flight attendant's eyes darted from Malcolm back to Karen. "Ma'am, sit down," she repeated, her voice tight with frustration. But Karen wasn't backing down. "No, I want answers," she demanded, pointing a finger at Malcolm. "What's he doing here? Why won't anyone listen to me? He could be a danger to all of us." Though absurd, her words had the intended effect. Passengers, who had been quietly watching, started murmuring, unsure of what to believe. Karen's baseless accusations were stirring up confusion and doubt. Malcolm remained seated, his expression calm, but inside he was seething. He knew responding to Karen would only escalate the situation. But the blatant racism, the public humiliation, it was becoming unbearable. He had spent his life proving people like her wrong, yet here he was reduced to a target for her ignorance and hatred. Another flight attendant approached, exuding authority. "Ma'am, sit down immediately, or you will be removed from the plane upon landing," she said coldly, eyes narrowing at Karen. For a second it seemed Karen might actually listen. She wavered, looking around to see if anyone was on her side. But when no one defended her, she let out a frustrated huff and sank back into her seat, muttering under her breath. The attendants exchanged relieved glances before moving away, thankful the situation hadn't escalated further. As the plane continued its descent, Malcolm exhaled, knowing the ordeal wasn't over. The silence after Karen sat down felt thick and uneasy, like the air was charged with tension, ready to erupt at any moment. Passengers around Malcolm shifted uncomfortably, glancing nervously between him and Karen. The plane neared the ground, and Malcolm tried to focus on the mission awaiting him, but Karen's hostility gnawed at him. Her eyes burned with malice, and though she was silent, her anger was palpable. "Unbelievable," she muttered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "They'll let anyone on planes these days. Don't know who's dangerous anymore." Malcolm clenched his jaw, taking slow, deep breaths. He had to stay calm. Responding would only give her the satisfaction she craved. But he was acutely aware of the ripple effect her words were having. Some passengers, initially neutral, now shifted uncomfortably, casting wary glances his way, as if her accusations had planted seeds of doubt. The plane touched down with a soft bump, the engines winding down. Everyone seemed relieved to have landed, as if the tension would dissipate once the plane stopped. But Malcolm knew better. Whatever Karen had started wasn't going to fade away just because they were on the ground. As the plane taxied to the gate, Malcolm prepared for what was coming. He knew how these situations could spiral, especially with someone like Karen. She wasn't the type to let things go quietly, and he had a sinking feeling she had something planned. Sure enough, the moment the plane halted and the seatbelt sign turned off, Karen sprang into action. She shot up from her seat, eyes flashing with self-righteous fury. Without hesitation, she marched to the front, cutting in front of passengers still gathering their belongings. "I need to speak to the pilot," she barked, her voice echoing through the cabin. Several heads turned to watch her. Even the flight attendants paused in confusion. "Ma'am, please return to your seat," one of the attendants said, stepping forward to block her path. Karen ignored her. "No, I need to speak to the pilot," she insisted louder. "This plane isn't safe. That man," she jabbed a finger in Malcolm's direction. "He could be dangerous." "I don't know why nobody's listening to me," Karen's frantic voice sliced through the tense silence. The passengers, who had been silently praying to leave the plane without further drama, were now frozen in place, eyes glued to the scene unfolding. The lead flight attendant approached, her expression tight with professional calm. "Ma'am, you need to calm down. If there's an issue, we can handle it after disembarking." Karen turned on her with a snarl. "No, this is an issue. You're all ignoring me. I'm trying to keep everyone safe, and you're just letting him sit there like everything's fine. I've been on enough planes to know when something's wrong." Whispers began to ripple through the crowd, and Malcolm could feel the uncertainty spreading like wildfire. Karen's baseless accusations were sowing seeds of doubt among the passengers. Malcolm's calm demeanor was now viewed through the distorted lens of Karen's hysteria, and the murmurs grew louder. The pilot, his face a mask of controlled annoyance, emerged from the cockpit. "Ma'am, what seems to be the problem here?" he asked, clearly hoping to defuse the situation quickly. Karen wasted no time. "The problem is him," she spat, pointing directly at Malcolm. "I don't feel safe with him on this plane. I don't know what he's up to, but I know something isn't right." The pilot glanced at Malcolm, then back at Karen, his eyebrows knitting together in confusion. "Ma'am, please calm down. There's no indication that anyone on this flight is a danger." "Are you serious? You're going to ignore a legitimate concern?" Karen's voice had reached a fever pitch, her face flushed red with frustration. "I want him off this plane and I want security to check him out. This is unacceptable." Malcolm felt the tension rising within him but remained seated. He could see where this was headed and knew that reacting would only make things worse. He'd been in worse situations before, but being treated like a threat simply because of his skin color in such a public setting was uniquely infuriating. The pilot sighed, clearly fed up. "Ma'am, we can address your concerns once we've all disembarked. Right now, I need you to return to your seat, or we'll have to call airport security." The mention of security seemed to rattle Karen for a moment, but then she squared her shoulders. "Good. Call security. They need to deal with him before something happens." She folded her arms and stood her ground, refusing to move until her demands were met. The flight attendants exchanged glances, realizing the situation had reached a breaking point. They didn't want to delay disembarkation any longer, but Karen's refusal to cooperate left them with little choice. Finally, one of the attendants picked up the intercom phone, her expression tense. "We need security at the gate, please." The tension in the cabin skyrocketed once more, and Malcolm could feel the stares intensify. Karen, satisfied that she was finally being heard, shot him a triumphant glare, as if she had won some twisted victory. As the plane doors opened and passengers began to file out slowly, Malcolm stayed seated, waiting for the inevitable arrival of security. He knew he could easily flash his credentials and shut this whole thing down, but part of him wanted to see how far Karen would go with her delusions of authority. It was one thing to deal with blatant racism, it was another to see how the system handled it. Passengers gave Malcolm a wide berth as they moved past him, unwilling to be associated with him in any way. Karen stood by the exit, arms crossed, watching everything unfold like she was a hero for alerting everyone to the danger. Malcolm leaned back in his seat, calm but alert, waiting for security to arrive and the real confrontation to begin. His thoughts remained steady, determined to let the truth speak louder than Karen's venomous accusations. He had faced situations like this before where assumptions and stereotypes painted an unfair picture, but this time he was ready to stand his ground. Footsteps approached, and 2 airport security officers boarded the plane, their serious expressions showing they had been briefed on a disturbance. Karen, her arms crossed and a smug grin on her face, pointed at Malcolm as they entered. "There he is," she said, her voice dripping with self-satisfaction. "He's the one I was telling you about. I don't feel safe with him on the plane. You need to check him out right now." The security officers exchanged glances, clearly wondering what kind of situation they were walking into. They approached Malcolm cautiously as if expecting a confrontation. But Malcolm stayed calm, his hands resting on his lap, making no sudden movements. He knew how these situations could escalate and was determined not to give anyone an excuse to misinterpret his actions. "Sir, "Can you come with us for a moment?" one of the officers said politely, though his tone carried the weight of authority. Malcolm stood up slowly, gathering his belongings. He didn't protest or argue, knowing that the truth would become clear soon enough. The passengers watched him with wide eyes, some whispering under their breath, wondering what was about to unfold. Karen stepped aside, her face beaming with triumph as if she had single-handedly saved the flight from some imaginary threat. "I knew something was off," she muttered to herself, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. As Malcolm followed the officers down the aisle, the tension in the air was palpable. The flight attendants and passengers made no move to intervene or offer support, allowing Karen's accusations to hang in the air unchallenged. It was a familiar feeling for Malcolm, being judged before anyone even knew the truth, but he remained steady, keeping his focus on what was to come next. They exited the plane and the cool airport air hit Malcolm's face. He was led to a small area near the gate where the officers planned to question him. Karen followed, standing a few feet away with her arms folded across her chest, eagerly awaiting the fallout from her complaint. She clearly expected Malcolm to be caught in some embarrassing or incriminating situation, and her eyes gleamed with anticipation. One of the officers finally spoke. "We received a report about some suspicious behavior on the plane. Can you explain what happened?" Malcolm took a deep breath, his voice calm and collected. "Before I answer any of that, I think it's important to show you something." He reached into his jacket pocket, moving slowly to avoid alarming the officers, and pulled out his wallet. He flipped it open, revealing a badge that gleamed under the fluorescent airport lights. Both officers' eyes widened as they leaned in closer to inspect it. It wasn't just any badge, it was the badge of a special agent with the FBI. Karen's face dropped instantly, the smug grin vanishing and replaced by a look of confusion and disbelief. Her eyes darted back and forth between Malcolm and the badge, struggling to process what she was seeing. "I'm Special Agent Malcolm Hayes, FBI," he said, locking eyes with the officers. "I've been traveling for work. If you need to check with my department, feel free to call." The two officers exchanged glances, suddenly realizing the gravity of their situation. They were no longer dealing with a random passenger but a federal agent, someone with authority that far surpassed theirs. The tone of the interaction shifted immediately. Agent Hayes, we apologize for the inconvenience," one of them stammered, his face flushing with embarrassment. "We were just responding to a report." Malcolm nodded, understanding their position. "I get it. You're just doing your job." Karen, on the other hand, looked like she had been hit by a truck. Her mouth hung open, words failing her for the first time since the ordeal had begun. She stumbled forward, trying to grasp at some explanation, some way to regain control of the situation that had so quickly slipped through her fingers. "Wait, what? He's FBI? That can't be right. I thought," she sputtered. Malcolm turned to face her, his expression calm but unwavering. "You thought what? That I was some kind of threat because of the color of my skin?" Karen stammered, struggling to form a coherent sentence. I didn't know." "No, you didn't know," Malcolm said, his voice firm. "You assumed. You judged me based on nothing but your own prejudices. And now that the truth is out, you don't know what to do with it." The onlookers who had gathered around the scene began to murmur, the weight of Karen's actions sinking in. The very passengers who had silently watched her harass Malcolm now looked at her with judgment in their eyes. Karen had expected to come out of this looking like a hero, but instead, she was the villain of her own story. One of the officers cleared his throat, cutting through the tension. "Agent Hayes, we're really sorry for the misunderstanding. You're free to go, of course. We'll handle this from here." Malcolm gave them a nod. "Thank you. I appreciate your professionalism." As he turned to walk away, Karen, still in a state of shock, reached out desperately. "Wait. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I didn't know." Malcolm stopped and looked over his shoulder at her, his gaze piercing. "The thing is, Karen, you could have just minded your own business. But instead you chose to escalate a situation that didn't exist. And now you have to live with the consequences of your actions." Karen stood there, speechless as Malcolm walked away, his demeanor in stark contrast to the chaos she had created. The crowd that had gathered began to disperse, casting cold glances in her direction as they left. The officers, realizing there was no actual threat, escorted Karen to a nearby seating area where she was left to stew in her humiliation. For Malcolm, it was just another day, another reminder of how far society still had to go. But as he stepped back into the airport, blending into the crowd once more, he knew that moments like these, where the truth triumphed over ignorance, were what made all the difference.